get set. How is everyone doing out there? It is myself, Jeff Black, joined with Brandon DeCruz. We are the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast. I sound better with carbs, I'm sure. Today is episode 68, how your caloric intake impacts the amount of calories you burn and how your diet influences your metabolism, energy expenditure, and need. It sounds like it's going to be gory is what it sounds like, but we're going to get into our last 7 days first, but this is a topic we get a lot of questions asked all the time about people and their calories and burning and everything. So Brandon put together a masterpiece as always. But B, how's your last 7 days been, bro? Have you got naked for the camera done any like foot pics that you thrown out there on the internet? Anything good that you've been making side hustle at?
Dear Lord. Well, I will say my week has been great, but none of those things have transpired. So I just want to make that very clear. This past weekend, I had some family who came up and visited. They came to Jersey the first time in 2 years that I've been able to see them. So I spent the weekend spending time with them and just catching up on them and taking advantage of the opportunity to see them because my family has kind of spread out, especially since the pandemic, where we're all over the country and we very rarely get to see one another. Besides that, training has been going really well. I'm just getting into week 4 of this DELT specialization cycle, and then business has been busy, which has been a blessing. All of my clients are currently crushing their summer goals, and it's been great to continue helping people not only transform their physiques, but their lives in general. And I always say that, to me, coaching or like real quality coaching goes far beyond the X's and O's of nutrition and training. And I feel like every single week I get better at like meeting clients where they're at, as well as helping to navigate like the obstacles or the hurdles within their lifestyle, so that they can avoid the mistakes they've made in the past and optimize the results they get. So, other than that, it's been a busy week of podcasting. I jumped on a bunch of podcasts last week that just came out. So if anyone's interested in hearing any of the shows I've recently done, I have them pulled up over here. So I will, read out the titles for you guys to be able to check out and be able to see, because I know a lot of people really liked hearing your recent podcast appearance on the Grow. Is it?
Yeah, Grow or Die, man. Like I
Grow
got
or Die
a
podcast.
lot
Yeah,
of great feedback on that one. Did you hear that one?
I had not.
It was it's the only one I've ever gone and listened to. My girl made me listen to it driving back from Pittsburgh. She's like, I really think you benefit because so many people have tagged you in the damn thing. And I was like, okay. And I was like,
well, now that I know the title now, so yeah, I will definitely look it up and
great interviewer. You should really connect with him. I might connect you too, because I think you'd be I think he'd enjoy a podcast with you. Awesome. But he's a great interviewer. At least I thought so. But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no worries. So I got 3 that came out just this past week. So the first one is Brandon DeCruz, Semaglutide, Understanding the Dark Side, the potential benefits, and who should and shouldn't use it. The next was the Coaches Roundtable with Brandon DeCruz and Jeff Hain. And the last one was just released yesterday, and it was the Female Fat Loss Series Part 1, Priming Your Body for Fat Loss. Other than that, everything is going well on my end. I do want to give a shout out to all our listeners. This past week, we had a tremendous reception about the last episode, especially because we covered a topic that a lot of people had said they had never heard of, or had, in terms of like they've heard the 3,500 calorie rule, but they didn't realize that was, I don't want to say a fallacy, but it just doesn't work in practice like it does on paper. And so, diving into a little bit more nuanced topics, covering things from a different angle than many, and then also diving into the research and providing that for you guys. That's something that we take and put a lot of time into first and foremost, but we want to deliver value. And that's something that's outside of this space. Jeff and I often have these conversations where we talk about the fact that things within this industry have just become redundant. People rob each other's content. They rob each other's, podcast ideas, titles, whatever it may be. And it's like, there's no originality in this space. And really, when it comes down to it, it's really hard to set yourself apart from others, because people just see those that have been successful and they just try to like rob, them of their content or of their knowledge and just keep it moving. And I really try to take a different angle to the show and cover, concepts or a take on a topic that isn't the same as everyone else. And the lucky part about it is that most people aren't as obsessive as me. So they're not going to go into the detail. They're not going to look past the abstract. They're not going to provide you guys with the deep insights into topics. So really, when it comes down to it, we just try to, blaze our own path and stay in our own lane. And we've gotten a great reception, and I'm really appreciative for those out there that share the show, that like the show. As always, guys, please be sure to rate and review the show. That really means a lot to us. And right now we're 5 stars. So don't give us any less.
Yeah, regardless if we talk about our last 7 days or not. My last 7 days, dude, were good. I competed at Masters Nationals. It felt so good to have a week off of work. I didn't have any check-ins, no clients. Just got to be really present. I got to watch someone really like, um, for once in a long time, like really just kind of like be like, hey, what do you need? And fulfill that need to a T. And I don't know, man. It felt good to be on that stage.
You looked great, dude. I'm proud
Thanks,
of you.
dude. Thanks, dude. So I'm waiting on feedback. I assume my legs need to come up, but I talked to Jason, so I'm, you don't even know this about me, B, and I don't really talk about this stuff too openly, but I think I am because I think that more people would benefit from an honest discussion. I haven't run a steroid cycle since 2018. I've been on HRT, and occasionally I do HRT plus and put like 200 primo in or things like that. But I haven't tried like high dose GH, and I've been talking to Kickle, and with my bone disease and what I was doing with BPC, I want to really see if I can like not only add some tissue, but maybe do it in a safer way than having to blast anabolics to try to grow a little bit. Because what's really happening is like if I'm at the point where I have to take off my upper body to match my legs, or I have to really try to force my legs to grow, which then puts me at middleweight. And I actually have an upper body of a middleweight. Like when I'm back there with those guys, like I'm dense, I'm thick, I can hang with those guys, but my legs are still like lightweight. So I'm going to work on that this off season, and kind of like really explore that. Maybe just training 4 days a week and doing 2 or 3 lower body days and just putting my upper on maintenance. But dude, I made a great connection, which I want to chat with you about. Audience, let us know. Would you guys like us to have Dr. Michael Isertel from Renaissance Periodization on the podcast? Because I made that connection with him, and he is a fan of Jeff Black. No, I'm just kidding. It was awkward conversation in the bathroom that I approached him with his dick out, but nonetheless, he was excited to come on our podcast. So if you guys are interested in him, let us know. We would love to get him on, and let us know what topics you guys want, because he is a lot, and the more narrow, the better. So we can make sure it's 5 damn good questions with him. But other than that, dude, I just had a great time. It was nice to kind of come back, unplug, work on my super a little bit, which is now a death trap. When you come down, I'll probably make you pee yourself in the car.
Dear Lord. Am I going to fit in it is my question.
No, you can, because Ben's 6'6", and he got into it yesterday,
Hey,
and
let's
I took
go.
one. But anyway, let's get into this. Episode 68, how your calorie intake impacts the amount of calories you burn, how your diet influences your metabolism, energy expenditure, and NEAT. First one, why the energy balance equation is dynamic and not static. I think it's we know a lot more than we did 20 years ago. When you and I were prepping 20 years ago, it was just eat more fish, cut out more carbs, eat more greens. It was just this horrible process to be a part of.
It was archaic.
It was very archaic. And now we've come to that. We've come a long way from that. So let's get into the weeds of that. Why is it more dynamic than just this static? I just keep cutting, and the result should always equal this.
Yes, so when we really look at the energy balance equation, essentially what this refers to is the relationship between our energy intake and our energy output. So our energy intake includes all the calories we consume from food, from drinks, and any calorie containing items we eat. And our calorie output is consisted of 4 different components. So we have our basal metabolic rate, which is the energy cost of living. We have our non-resting energy expenditure, which includes both our non-exercise and our exercise activity. And we have the thermic effect of feeding. So when we're in a state of energy balance, aka at maintenance, our calorie intake matches our calorie output, which allows us to maintain our body weight. When our calorie intake exceeds our calorie output, such as when we're in a surplus, we're in a state of what's called positive energy balance. So whatever excess energy we consume that isn't used for fuel is stored as either fat, muscle, or glycogen. And when we go into a calorie deficit, where our calorie intake is less than our calorie output, our body has to pull from stored sources of energy to meet our energy demands. And it can do so from various tissues. So it can pull from fat, it can pull from glycogen, or it can pull from muscle because we're in this state of negative energy balance. And energy balance is often simplified down to intake and output, meaning calories in versus calories out. But it's a dynamic situation where one affects the other. And if we were really to simplify it down correctly, we'd have to say that on average, when our calories in decrease, our calorie output decreases. And when our calorie intake increases, our calorie output increases. And this is because calories in and calories out are intrinsically tied, meaning when we change one, we change the other. So if we decrease our calorie intake, it'll have downstream effects which decrease our calorie output. But this is also true in the opposite direction, meaning if we increase our calorie intake, it'll increase our calorie output or our ability to burn calories. And this doesn't mean that calories in versus calories out isn't factual. It's just more like much more complex than many realize. A lot of times we hear these simple stories, these simple messages, and people just try to say, eat less and exercise more, and all these different like catchphrases that are supposed to be helpful, but they aren't at all. They're truthful, they're not useful. So although we often just talk about energy balance as calories in and calories out, which sounds simple in premise, it's actually much more complex when we look at how our calorie intake impacts and influences our calorie output and expenditure, as both are dynamic systems. So changing one changes the other, but the extent to how much one changes the other varies between people, especially on the energy expenditure or calorie output side of things. So on today's podcast, we're going to discuss how the amount of calories we eat impacts our metabolism, our physical activity levels, and the amount of calories we burn per day, and how our state of energy balance affects our ability to lose or gain both body fat and body weight, because these are things that a lot of people are interested in, especially with the last podcast. There's a lot of questions about individuality. So within literature, we would look at this as response heterogeneity, and essentially that means how do different people respond to different interventions. So that could be training interventions, that could be nutrition interventions. So today we're going to get into the weeds about not only how our calorie intake influences our calorie output, but the differences between individuals.
All right, let's get into this. So, how does metabolic adaptation work in both directions? Often we only hear about the negative one, very rarely in the surplus one. If you've ever pushed food for any length of time, you know that that exists, and it's very interesting how they work on both sides. But let's get into the weeds. B, I know you probably found research to really hammer this home, so let's get into it.
Right, yeah, no, you're 100% right, my man. Because often when people discuss their metabolism and their total daily energy expenditure, they refer to it almost as though they're set in stone and they don't change. So people will make statements like they have a slow or they have a fast metabolism, not realizing that their total daily energy expenditure can change a ton over time. So someone who has a quote unquote slow metabolism now can change various aspects of their diet, their training, their body composition, and their lifestyle over time, which can drastically increase or decrease the amount of calories they burn per day and the amount of food that they can eat and maintain their body composition on. This is because our metabolism and our total daily energy expenditure aren't static entities. So all components of our metabolism or our total daily energy expenditure are impacted by how much we eat and what we eat. Now, often when we've spoken about like topics such as metabolic adaptation or even adaptive thermogenesis, we've mainly spoken about how metabolic, essentially our metabolic rate and our energy expenditure change and go down when we've been in a deficit and have lost a significant amount of body fat and body weight. And this is because this is the form of metabolic adaptation that most will experience. Because if we really look at like dieting statistics, we see that between 42 to 61% of adults go on a diet each year in an attempt to lose weight. So this form of down regulation is what most people are going to see. So we've done previous episodes. Actually, I think today is like the year anniversary that we released our metabolic adaptation masterclass. So that's episode 15. And we discuss, when we lose body fat, we see that a prolonged period of decreasing calorie intake impacts all aspects of our total daily energy expenditure, including our basal metabolic rate, our thermic effect of feeding, NEAT, as well as exercise activity thermogenesis. But what a lot of people overlook and they don't realize is that metabolic adaptation and adaptive thermogenesis also work in the opposite direction. Meaning, when we increase our calorie intake, we actually upregulate and see positive adaptations in the opposite direction. So, when we decrease our calories for a prolonged period of time, our body downregulates physiological processes to conserve energy. Whereas, when we increase calories for a long period of time and either go back to maintenance, whether that be during a reverse or a recovery diet, or even during a maintenance phase, or we increase calories above maintenance during a building phase, our body upregulates different physiological processes, which allow us to waste energy and burn more calories as a result. So when we increase our calories either back to maintenance or above maintenance, we see various things. So we'll see a restoration in basal metabolic rate, which is generally suppressed during a deficit. We see an increase in the thermic effect of feeding from eating more food. We see an increase in NEAT because we have more energy in the system. We also see an increase in exercise activity thermogenesis, aka the amount of calories we burn during exercise, as we have more calories to fuel both hard and intense training sessions. We see an increase in hormones that help to increase energy expenditure, such as thyroid output and leptin production. We see increases in sex hormone production like testosterone and estradiol, all of which help to increase the total amount of calories we burn per day. This is important for people to realize, as they often only focus on how dieting decreases the amount of calories they burn per day, not realizing that when they get out of a deficit and back to maintenance or above maintenance, that these diet-induced or these essentially deficit-induced metabolic adaptations will both be minimized and reversed if done correctly. So in order to look at how our calorie intake impacts our calorie expenditure when essentially increasing our calorie intake above our maintenance calorie intake level and going into surplus, we can look at various overfeeding studies we have where they meticulously measure calorie intake and calorie expenditure. And significant overfeeding studies have shown that an increase in metabolism and total daily energy expenditure happens when you take in more energy, as most people, as a result of taking in more calories in, they increase the amount of calories they burn out. And it's important to realize that this increase in both resting metabolic rate and total daily energy expenditure doesn't mean that you're going to lose weight as a result of eating more, because that's a big fallacy in this industry. Like people will try to sell a simple story where like, I'm going to have you eat more and lose more fat. Like the reason that you're not losing body fat is because you're not eating enough. That is a fallacy. However, there are these positive metabolic adaptations that come from going into a surplus, where essentially what happens is when you increase your calories, you're going to be able to burn off some of the excess calories that you're taking in. So essentially, it's negating part of that surplus due to an upregulation in metabolism and total daily energy expenditure.
Okay, then I want to kind of go into how our calorie intake impacts the amount of calories we burn through physical activity. Like, how is NEAT changed in a calorie surplus and the calorie deficit?
All right. So we have a vast amount of literature on this. And I think the best way to look at this is to look at controlled overfeeding and underfeeding studies. So in controlled overfeeding and underfeeding studies, we see that when people are put on calorie intakes that go either far above their baseline maintenance intakes or far below their maintenance intakes, this directly impacts and changes how many calories they expend and burn per day. And what we see in most of the tightly controlled overfeeding studies that we have is that when we increase the amount of calories we eat, it increases the amount of calories we burn off, as eating more increases our basal metabolic rate, and even more so, the amount of calories we burn through physical activity and NEAT. And so in last week's episode on the 3,500 calorie per pound rule, we discuss how and why the 3,500 calorie rule doesn't always hold up when it comes to weight loss, and why weight loss is never linear. But we also have overfeeding studies dating back to the 60s, where they started to realize that the 3,500 calorie per pound rule didn't hold up amongst all individuals when it came to weight gain either. So in one of the first overfeeding studies, called the Vermont overfeeding study that was done in 1968, they found that body weight gain was lower than expected from the excess calorie intake given to participants, which caused them to question the concept of linear weight change from a given calorie amount. And back then, they explained this difference in projected weight gain as compared to the actual amount of weight participants gained being due to an increase in energy expenditure with overfeeding. And really what they postulated that was for was it was a dissipative mechanism to oppose weight gain, which is one of the studies that the body weight set point theory was founded on. And at this point, they hadn't termed NEAT yet. So they weren't aware that that was a concept. And so they initially thought that the reason people weren't gaining as much weight as they expected based on how many calories they were giving them was because they were gaining lean mass and they were walking more, both of which increase energy expenditure, but also because as we gain weight, there's an increased calorie cost for walking, which they believe contributed to this. But at the time, they didn't realize how large of a role NEAT played in this equation. And it wasn't actually until 1999, so, less than 25 years ago, where researchers realized how much the amount of calories we burn through NEAT can be impacted and increased by simply eating more calories. So in 1999, Dr. James Levine did a landmark study essentially, where what he did was he conducted an overfeeding study, which really elucidated the role that NEAT plays in energy expenditure and body weight regulation. So prior to the start of this overfeeding period, they measured literally every single morsel of food these people eat and every calorie containing item that these, participants, put in their gullet essentially. And they were able to determine exactly how many calories it took them to remain weight stable. So after a stabilization period where they had these people in energy balance, so they were right at maintenance calories, and they had their maintenance intake dialed in, what they did was they overfed each individual by 1,000 extra calories per day consistently over 8 weeks. So they received an extra 56,000 calories over that 8-week period. So if the 3,500 calorie rule really worked as many believe it does, each person within this study should have gained 2 pounds per week and essentially 16 pounds over the course of the study as a result of being in 1,000 calorie surplus daily. During the study, they measured every aspect of each person's metabolism in response to this massive increase in calorie intake. And what they found was that at the end of 8 weeks, some people barely gained any weight or fat despite being in 1,000-calorie surplus per day, whereas others gained a ton more weight and specifically fat mass in response to that exact same 1,000-calorie increase over their baseline maintenance calorie intake. So, for example, the average weight gain over the 8-week overfeeding period was a little over 10 pounds, but it ranged anywhere from people just gaining 3 pounds to people gaining 16 pounds. So it was a vast, difference between the two. And when looking at different compartments of these participants' total daily energy expenditure, they found on average that this prolonged overfeeding period led to an average increase in daily energy expenditure of 554 calories per day, and 2/3 of this increase were due to increases in NEAT, which accounted for an average of around 330 extra calories burned per day. However, these were the averages across the group. So on average, people burned an extra 330 calories or so from increases in NEAT. But when researchers looked at the individual participants' changes in NEAT levels, they found that some participants increased their energy expenditure through NEAT by around 700 calories per day, while others decreased their NEAT by around 100 calories per day. So in those who increased their NEAT during overfeeding, this increase in NEAT burns through as much as 69% of the extra calories they've consumed. So it was originally 1,000-calorie surplus at the start of study, eventually was reduced down to around a 300-calorie surplus due to how much more active these individuals became. And when they looked specifically at changes in fat storage and fat mass gain, not just weight gain, they found that changes in NEAT accounted for up to a 10-fold difference in fat storage and directly predicted resistance to fat gain with overfeeding. So what this study shows us is that when someone is overfeeding or eating in a surplus, those who increase their NEAT the most gain the least amount of fat, whereas those who go into a surplus and don't increase their NEAT gain the most fat. So NEAT is essentially a fundamentally important component to consider in weight gaining body composition change. And what's interesting is these participants' weight and body comp changes were not predicted or influenced by their baseline starting weight. So it wasn't like those who were leaner at the start gained less weight and fat, and those who were heavier at the start gained more weight and fat. It was not predicted by what they started at. It was pretty much just based on how they ramped up or decreased their NEAT levels. So those who increase NEAT when eating more do not gain a lot of fat, whereas, essentially in a surplus, whereas those who don't increase, they gain a lot of fat for the same surplus. And these are all, examples of how our energy expenditure increases when we eat more calories. However, the same thing is seen in the opposite direction when we decrease calories and go into a deficit for a prolonged period of time and lose both body weight and body fat. So in 2008, Rosenbaum did a study looking at how much of a reduction in total daily energy expenditure dieters who have lost a significant amount of their body weight sustained. And in these individuals, they lost at least 10% of their starting body weight. And they found that on average, there was a 500-calorie reduction in the amount of calories they were burning per day after having achieved this large amount of weight loss. So what they did after was they analyzed and broke down this metabolic adaptation of 500 calories into multiple components to see what aspects of their total daily energy expenditure were impacted the most from losing that weight. And they found that those who had lost 10% of their body weight saw around 100-calorie reduction in the resting metabolic rate. So oftentimes we speak about resting metabolic rate, and that's what people think gets downregulated the most, and it's honestly not. However, when they analyzed the rest of the components that contributed to this large decrease in energy expenditure, they found that their physical activity energy expenditure, aka their NEAT, had decreased by around 400 calories per day due to their weight loss. And the vast majority of research that we have on fat loss and weight loss interventions find that up to 85 to 90% of the downregulations in energy expenditure we experience when dieting come strictly from decreases in NEAT, because being in a deficit and losing weight generally causes us to subconsciously downregulate our activity levels, even if we're not thinking about it. Like we're doing things like sitting more, we're slouching more, we're compensating more. You're not fidgeting as much, you're not speaking with your hands as much. So these are all things that cause us to be less active in our day-to-day lives. So by looking at research on how increasing our calories in a surplus and going into a deficit and decreasing our calories impacts the amount of calories we burn per day, we see that energy balance is a dynamic equation, and our metabolisms are both reactive and dynamic systems, which can change over time. And this research also shows the massive impact in our activity levels and movement via NEAT can have on whether we increase the amount of calories we burn per day or decrease the amount of calories we burn per day. And the relationship between both physical activity levels and our body composition was analyzed in a recent review on the role of energy expenditure on body weight regulation and maintenance, which looked at a decade's worth of research on how energy intake impacts energy expenditure. And essentially what they looked at was, how did this impact our ability to regulate our body weight? And their findings suggested that those who don't increase their energy expenditure in different states of energy balance appear to be more susceptible to gaining fat and developing obesity, and also tend to lose less fat when dieting, regardless if they start off lean or obese, which is another reason why, honestly, for years I've been focusing on and speaking about the importance of neat physical activity and just general movement, daily movement, with my clients as well as with podcasts, because this is something that's so important to be aware of different changes within our calorie intake, within our diet, within our lifestyle, how it can impact. We're in an obesity epidemic where people are continually gaining around 1 to 2 pounds per year. And a lot of people, don't realize how much more sedentary we've gotten over the years. And there's things that interventions we could put within our lifestyle, whether it be nutrition, it be training, but also movement is a huge facilitator of keeping fat gain off as well as facilitating fat loss.
So then what is the variability of weight change in response to surplus and deficits? We tend to kind of, I think, overcomplicate both of them, meaning is there like why is that variability, I guess, would be a better way said, between the surplus and deficits? I'd probably just reword it differently. Thank you, Carbs, for coming back in, maybe.
Yeah, so we have a ton of studies on this topic, especially looking at overfeeding individuals in tightly controlled settings, where what they essentially do in many of the studies, and it's kind of like almost looks like a blanketed prescription, just like within the dieting industry, we utilize, like, a lot of people will say, if you want to gain mass, 500 calorie surplus. If you want to lose, fat, 500 calorie deficit. Like a lot of people within our, especially like the generalized nutrition context, they'll have like these blanketed prescriptions, which I don't believe in, because they're not individualized and they're not considering the individual context of the person that they're working with. However, in a lot of the overfeeding studies, they'll have like these generalized approaches, because that's how they pass research. And research is really looking at one variable in isolation and seeing how it impacts individuals. So what they do is they'll generally increase their energy intake by an average of 1,000 calories over their maintenance calorie intakes for long periods of time. Yet what they find is that they don't gain the amount of weight that you'd expect from that large and sustained calorie increase. And if we calculated the amount of fat someone would experience with 1,000 calorie overfeeding, based on the 3,500 calorie per pound rule, we'd expect they'd gain X amount of pounds over an intervention based on the amount of time that they were in that surplus. But there's a large variability in response between individuals. So some will upregulate their energy expenditure via NEAT and physical activity so much that this 1,000 calorie surplus will be mostly eaten away at. And so they barely gain any weight, which is something I've seen, with certain clients during like building phases. I've also seen it with myself, where I've upregulated activity and it seems like I'm eating a ton of food, but I'm burning through it essentially. Yet some will decrease their energy expenditure and sit more and actually gain mostly fat as a result. As these extra calories have to go somewhere. So if they're not being burnt, they're being stored. And so this is why we have to realize that no two surpluses are the same. And this is also why we can't just spit out a certain calorie amount that all individuals should eat at to either gain muscle or lose body fat. And the best examples of how variable weight gain and weight loss can be between individuals when they've been given the same either relative surplus or relative deficit are a series of studies by Claude Bouchard, who conducted both overfeeding and underfeeding studies, meaning he put people into tightly controlled surpluses and deficits and then monitored their responses to each. So in one of his overfeeding studies, Bouchard took college-age males and had them stay in a metabolic ward. So everything that they did, how they moved, and what they ate was monitored. And he then fed them by 1,000 calories over their maintenance intake 6 days per week for a 100-day period. So for that 100-day trial, they had 84 days, or essentially 12 weeks, of being overfed by 1,000 calories per day, which amounted to an 84,000 calorie surplus. By the end of the overfeeding period, they found that the changes in these participants' body composition and fat gain were considerably different. So they saw an average body weight increase of 17.8 pounds, with around 12 pounds of that coming from fat mass and around 6 pounds coming from fat-free mass increases. But there were some individuals who gained 9.5 pounds, so they gained much less. However, there was others that gained 29 pounds. So there was a 20-pound difference, or essentially a threefold difference in weight gain across subjects. Now, as we discussed in last week's episode about the 3,500 calorie per pound rule, we'd expect that if someone ate 84,000 calories over their maintenance, they'd gain 24 pounds based on this rule. But some gained a little under 9.5 pounds, and others gained over 29 pounds, which is why this rule doesn't always apply, as our calorie intake influences our calorie expenditure. And when they looked at the difference in fat mass gain between individuals, there was about a 6-fold difference between individuals. So this means that the individuals who only gained 9.5 pounds had a massive increase in energy expenditure, which allowed them to burn through much of the excess calories they took in, while those who gained much more weight than predicted actually had a decrease in their calorie expenditure as a result of this overfeeding period and gained much more fat mass as a result. So although this was 1,000 calorie surplus over their initial maintenance calorie intake on paper, how one person responds to 1,000 calorie surplus is different than how another person responds to 1,000 calorie surplus. And often this relates to how someone's NEAT changes in response to overfeeding. And, essentially what this shows is that there's a large variability in terms of how individuals store excess energy and whether that's stored as either fat mass or lean mass, and how this increase in calorie intake impacts various aspects of energy expenditure. Now, on the deficit side of things, Bouchard also conducted studies where essentially what he did was he induced a calorie deficit and then monitored weight loss in subjects. And in one of his studies, he took college-age males and found their maintenance intake and then fed them that exact amount and had them create 1,000 calorie deficit just through exercise. So over the course of a little over a 90-day trial, these participants cycled twice per day, and researchers tightly monitored how many calories they burned per session to ensure that they were creating 1,000 calorie deficit. So this was all through exercise, but they were in a daily 1,000 calorie deficit. And they found that on average, weight loss was 11 pounds, all of which came from a loss in fat mass. So they lost exclusively fat and body fat. But when we look across the group to see the different variability in weight loss, we see that some only lost around 8 pounds, whereas others lost 17 pounds despite inducing the same calorie deficit. So it's not that calorie deficits or surpluses don't work. It's that there's a massive difference in an individual's response based on how changes in their calorie intake impacts their calorie output. And so we have to realize that we're all individuals and we're going to respond differently. So we have to be more attuned and more aware to be really paying attention to how differences in our diet impact differences in our activity levels, in our output, in our energy levels, and things of that sort, so that we realize that we can't always expect that what a calorie calculator spits out or an expectation or a projection that we have in our mind is really going to be what we see on the scale or in the mirror.
So then how do men and women differ in their response to overfeeding, other than just getting fat, which would be the obvious sarcastic just front answer one would say?
Oh God. Well, I unfortunately the literature is going to back up what you're thinking, my man. So when it comes down to honestly, we have to say this in advance that we see that no two people respond the same way to a calorie deficit or calorie surplus. We see this in practice, but also they see this in the literature. And that's due to many reasons. That's, partly due to adherence. So whether they're, the person's actually really accurately nailing their target calorie intake or not, part of it's genetic. And yet one of the most influential aspects of someone's response to different calorie intakes is based on their activity levels and their lifestyle, as well as how those things change over time. So someone that was really active that becomes sedentary over time could be at the same calorie intake that they've been eating for a decade. However, now they're packing on fat as a result. Now, when it comes to how different individuals in different sexes respond to calorie surpluses, just like when it comes to a calorie deficit and how our body decreases calorie expenditure during a diet, this will range heavily from person to person, as there are inter-individual differences to how we all respond to calorie deficits and calorie surpluses. So when we increase our calories over maintenance and go into a surplus, we're in an excess of energy, which causes our bodies to be more wasteful with that energy, as there's more than enough for all the physiological functions and now has more calories that can be burned off for other activities. And although we see in most of the overfeeding studies that there's a large variation between individuals and how they respond to calorie increases, which is why a given calorie surplus may lead one person to gain much more lean mass and less fat mass when they make this increase, while another person may gain more total weight and total fat in the same exact calorie surplus. But when we look at tightly controlled overfeeding studies, we generally see that there's two populations that don't see as much of an increase in energy expenditure via NEAT during times of overfeeding. And the first one of that is those in the older population. So the older you are, the less likely you are to upregulate your energy expenditure when overfeeding. And that's something we generally would see, as we see the trajectory over the life course, you become less active. And then if you're increasing calories, you're going to be more likely to gain fat, less likely to burn off that excess energy. But the other population we see this in is females. So we generally see that for the same amount of calories of overfeeding, females will upregulate energy expenditure less and tend to not move as much as males. So they end up gaining more weight and more fat than males do for the same exact surplus. And this was specifically seen in Levine's study on overfeeding that we covered, where each participant, both men and women, were given 1,000-calorie surplus, as they found that females exhibited the lowest values for NEAT, meaning their energy expenditure didn't increase as much in response to overfeeding as it did in males. So they tended not to move as much. But we also see this in other overfeeding studies just on female participants. So really, when it comes down to it, we're seeing that it's not as likely for females to have a response on overfeeding in terms of having a positive response in upregulated NEAT, which means that we have to be a little bit more aware of how we're manipulating calories with females. And we have specific studies on just females and doing overfeeding. So for example, in one study, they overfed females by 50% over their maintenance calorie requirements. So if a woman's maintenance calorie requirements were, say, 2,000 per day, that means she'd be eating 3,000 calories per day. And they only found an increase in energy expenditure of 17.9%, which is really small given the large surplus these females were put into. So although I think it's important to be aware of the sex specific differences in overfeeding responses between men and women, I don't want any women in our audience to think that they're doomed to gain fat if they go into a surplus. All this really means, and the reason I cover this, is because we have to consider the inter-individual differences, both between individuals, but also between sexes. But it also is just an awareness tool that we have to be more strategic when increasing calories, and also be mindful of tracking NEAT via steps to make sure that you don't actually decrease your steps as we increase calories, because that was actually one thing that was seen in the Levine study. The person that downregulated their energy expenditure by 100, in terms of the variability when they were overfed by 1,000, was a female. So really, she went from being in 1,000-calorie surplus to an 1,100-calorie surplus, which is only going to exacerbate the fat gain in that overfeeding period. Jeff, you're off.
Yeah, I know. I'm playing with this new thing I got. I'm currently on a customer support thing because we're trying to get my sound just right because I have this Focusrite thing. It's great, great. How do then we avoid excess weight gain and make fat loss more efficient?
All right, so we have went over, tons of overfeeding studies at this point where they find that when someone moves more when eating in a surplus, they gain less fat, which is one effective way to prevent weight gain. But we also can look at, a person's body composition, their average activity levels, to see what those who are lean do. And, essentially, success leaves clues. So if we look at those who are lean and maintain their weight, what do they do on a daily basis as compared to those who are gaining weight? So the same researcher that conducted the study on overfeeding, Levine, him and his colleagues have done research looking at the lifestyle habits of those who are lean and those who are obese, and have found that those who are lean average 2.25 more hours moving per day than those who are obese, and also spend 2.5 hours less per day seated than those who are obese. And they also spend more time standing as well. And so in one study, they analyzed the activity levels and amount of calories lean and obese individuals burned while working in the same office building doing similar jobs. And they found that lean individuals in the same office setting burn a lot more calories per day moving, just even if they don't do intentional exercise. So when we looked at the difference in calorie burn, just within the context of an office, so say an 8-hour office day, the lean individuals were burning 350 more calories through ambulation, such as regular movements and activity, activities of daily living, than those who were obese. So this study led them to conclude that evidence suggests that low NEAT may occur in obesity, but in a very specific fashion. And obese individuals appear to exhibit an innate tendency to be seated for 2.5 hours more per day than their sedentary lean counterparts. So if obese individuals were to adopt the lean habits of NEAT of those who are lean, they could potentially expend an extra 350 calories per day.
Wow.
So NEAT is the most adaptive component of our total daily energy expenditure and accounts for the majority of metabolic adaptation that we see in a diet, as decreases in NEAT activities add up to the largest portion of the reduction of calories we burn per day during a diet. And NEAT is also part of our total daily energy expenditure that varies the most from individual to individual, as the amount of calories we burn through NEAT can vary up to 2,000 calories per day for two people of the exact same body weight and body size. Whereas in other components of our energy expenditure, such as our resting metabolic rate, two people of the same weight and size are never going to vary that much. We're never going to see a 2,000 calorie discrepancy or disparity between two individuals.
Yep.
And when it comes down to it, most clients I encounter, or even listeners of the show who I speak to, they have the goal of getting leaner, or if they've already gotten lean, their goal is to be able to stay lean, but they want to be able to do so in a manner that doesn't require them to be in a deficit year round, where they constantly feel like they're in a state of caloric restriction. And this is where not only knowing more about, energy balance and how your calorie intake affects your calorie expenditure can be helpful. But another helpful thing would be to look at your lifestyle and your daily routines, your habits and your behaviors as a whole, and then ask yourself how the leaner version of yourself would go throughout the course of their day. So would, the lean version of yourself, would they sit more or stand more? Would they move more or would they move less? Would they be less active when eating in a surplus, or would they take advantage of that extra energy
Right.
intake and train harder and put it to good use? And I bet they would stand more, they'd move more, they'd be more active. So my advice to everyone out there is to stop being like chained to your chair, which is something we see so prominent and prevalent in today's society, and get moving, especially if improving your body composition and health is your goal. And so when it really comes down to it, you have to realize how your dietary intake and how calories in can affect calories out. But by having this awareness tool, you could be more likely to make different changes and revisions into your daily activities, into your daily lifestyle and your routine, your habits and behaviors, to be able to put yourself in a more advantageous position to get your goal.
Oh, dude, that was really, really well said. And I want to, if you all, if there was an error on my audio, will you all let me know? I had an audio flash error that required me to call customer service. So let me know if there was an issue. It says it was still recording because I see my lines moving. But if you guys notice any crackling or anything that we can't hear, please let me know so that way I can get that adjusted. I'm trying to always upgrade my sound so I could try stuff before I make Brandon invest to make him sound better too. Because dear Lord, we went through the microphones there for a minute in the beginning when we were first starting. Yeah. Where can everybody find you, B? Because that was a hell of a podcast. And if you guys have any questions, any follow-up stuff you guys want us to do, we could probably pull a Q&A together sometime on our most recent ones, because we've had some top hits here in the past few weeks where people might want to know some more.
Absolutely, guys. Feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at @BrandonDeCruz_, or you guys can find me at bdecruzfitness@gmail.com. Jeff, wrap it on up, my man.
Well, you guys can find me, my usual asshole self, Jeff Unbreakable Black on Instagram and on YouTube with Relentless Forever. So yeah, that's pretty much where it's at. B, dude, thank you for putting together such a good one.
Always, my man.
I got. All right, well, you all have yourself a great day, and B, I'll catch you next week.
Peace.
Peace.